This is the GALAX GTX 1070Ti Sniper White graphics card. Now I think white is slightly misleading because the shroud here may appear white on camera, and I've done my best to kind of neutralize the white balance on the camera, but the shroud itself is actually more or less like an eggshell off-white, almost a cream color when you compare it to an authentic white shroud that's rather neutral, meaning it doesn't have any bluish or reddish tones. It's neither cool nor warm. This one is definitely warmer than usual, and it does have a hint of tan in it, which is why it doesn't look very good when thrown into a system like this one, which I've done my best to keep as neutral as possible. I'm starting things off pretty harsh here, but for good reason. I feel like GALAX is slightly misleading the consumer when they publish neutral white photos of this card, when in fact it is not the case in real life. So don't be misled. You guys are going to see a couple of comparisons here between a card that I think is more or less neutral white and this one. My walls, for example, are not white. They are actually more of a cream tan color, and this card is much closer to that than it is to a true neutral white. So this is something that you should keep in mind. It's misleading. I don't know how else to word it. This is one of the reasons why manufacturers don't like manufacturing white components. I was talking to Chris back when he worked at Be Quiet, and he told me that one of the reasons why they haven't mass-produced white fans, for example, is because the fan blades are manufactured in one space, the frames are manufactured in another place, and getting those two white tones to match perfectly is a very difficult process, especially when those sites for manufacturing are on totally different sides of the planet. I can give GALAX some credit though. They at least kept the shroud and the backplate the same tone of white, so no mismatching on their end. Now 1070 Ti reviews at this point are a little redundant, at least for tech tubers, because whoop-de-doo, it falls right between a 1070's performance and a 1080's performance. We're going to look at thermals, we're going to see how loud this card gets under load. I'm not going to do any manual overclocking because this card already gets pretty toasty as is, but it does stay relatively quiet, and that's something else I can commend this card for. These 100mm fans here do a great job dissipating heat through the nickel-plated cooler underneath. It's not the beefiest cooler. You'll find this card isn't very heavy, and that's something you typically want to look for with a graphics card. You know, the heavier the card, usually the beefier the cooling solution, which means that you can hit higher overclocks. This card wasn't anything phenomenal in that respect. I think this is more of an aesthetic approach, and again, apart from the off-white shroud, I don't think it's a bad looking card. This card is RGB supported, so you have two zones. The first surrounds the backplate and the PCB up top. You have this little plastic guide here that does a decent job at spreading out the light, and then a GeForce GTX logo, which is also illuminated, and these are both controlled together via software on GALAX's website, which you can find linked in the video description if you're interested in where to find that. It's an easier place if you have a card already like this one. There are also LEDs underneath surrounding these 120mm fans, at least surrounding the central portions of the fan. So there are 3 LEDs for each one, and they only illuminate white, and if you have your card turned vertically like so, then you're going to definitely see those 3 light sources. They don't do a great job at spreading out, even though they've kind of like made these fans slightly transparent. It just, the light itself is not very spread out, as you can see along these fans. So it looks a little tacky there. I would like to have seen a more uniform distribution of light down here. Something else to note, this card does not store RGB codes in cache, which means that upon booting into Windows for the first time, or even after just a quick power cycle, the card will display white LEDs by default. So in other words, until you open the software after booting into Windows, your card will not take on the RGB color scheme that you set it to the last time you were in the operating system. You can control other things in the software as well. It's more or less like a rudimentary MSI afterburner, if you will, with the RGB support on board. So you can overclock this card via the tool, and you can also control the card's fan curves. In terms of power delivery, this card really is nothing special. It does have an extra 6-pin VGA power connector, so that's something else to keep in mind. You will have a slightly higher overclocking headroom over that of the standard 1070 Ti Founders Edition card. Not even sure it's worth manually overclocking this card because it's pretty much maxed out of the box, and NVIDIA software is pretty good about, you know, fluctuating those frequencies according to load as well as thermals. And speaking of those temps, this card stays off the radar. That's a good thing, especially when running 3D Mark, Firestrike, even in like the Ultra, the Extreme preset. This card handled the higher resolutions and just the intense scenes much better than I expected, especially from a cooling standpoint. You know, this card isn't very heavy. I thought that the thinner material would yield higher temperatures than what I was experiencing. Now the memory got pretty toasty at around 85 degrees Celsius, Celsius. This still isn't anywhere near Micron's limit, so I'd say we're pretty good on the memory side. If we wanted to overclock a bit more, we'd probably have that headroom. And then the GPU stayed around 70 degrees Celsius, which I would say is more than comfortable. You could push this to around 80 degrees if you really wanted, but the fans would definitely become audible, and that just really depends on if you're comfortable with a loud system or not. If you're wearing headphones, maybe it won't bother you as much. Now, just a few other things I want to point out regarding this card in particular. The backplate is raised slightly higher than the conventional backplate on most cards, most aftermarket cards anyway, and because of that, I would say that this doesn't have any thermal properties at all. In fact, the only reason why they probably raised this as high as they did is to allow this diffuser for the LEDs to be included underneath, and it's a nice touch. It's something I'm not going to be too picky about, but there is something else you should know about this. Because the backplate, again, is pretty high off the PCB, PCIe slot brackets for full-length slots are going to be difficult to unlatch, especially after putting this card into place, unless you have a really large latch that you can push back to unhook the card from the motherboard. It's going to be difficult to get to this one, so have a narrow tool on hand to unlatch the card if you plan on removing it anytime soon. Now, the last things I want to discuss are price and value. These are subjective terms. Again, it's going to depend on what you feel your money's worth and also where you live, because GALAX cards aren't sold everywhere. The US is one of the few exceptions on this side of the globe, for example. So if you live elsewhere, maybe Canada, you might want to buy one of these secondhand if you're really into white cards. But the value proposition, I really think the 1070 Ti Sniper and the 1070 Sniper, both black and white, I feel like are the poor man's Hall of Fame cards. So if you want to buy a Hall of Fame card, you're going to spend anywhere between $100 and $200 extra on top of just the board itself to get that additional cooling capacity and those really clean looks, right? The white PCB with the white shroud and the white fans, those cards look super sexy. But it seems like every time I check online, these cards are either out of stock or extremely overpriced, which is where a card like this kind of comes into play, right? When this is the only thing available from a company like GALAX, this is what you're going to try to sell, which is probably why I got this card. A lot of other reviewers, it seems, are also receiving the 1070 Sniper cards. So they're really trying to press these. The prices are relatively competitive for, you know, the current market that we're in, although I think they missed the aesthetic mark definitely with the off-white shroud and the off-white backplate. The RGB accents, customizable, are nice. The proprietary software isn't too overbearing, and the card runs relatively quiet. So take these for what they are. If you like this video, be sure to let me know by giving this one a thumbs up. I appreciate it. Thumbs down for the opposite. Click the subscribe button if you haven't already, and stay tuned for more content like this. This is Science Studio. Thanks for learning with us.